Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Kamhi, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you so much for joining me, Kamhi, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. I'm so happy to have on board with us as our guest today the very famous Susun Weed, herbalist. Susun is loved and honored for her work in women's health and herbal medicine, and she's the author of the well-known Wise Woman Herbal Series, which offers simple, safe medicines. And she directs the working of the Wise Woman Center. She is a high priestess of Dianic Wicca and has been inducted as a peace elder. Susun uses her encyclopedic knowledge of herbs and health in her service to people everywhere with a focus on women. So thank you so much for joining us today, Susun.
I'm so happy to join you, and I'm so excited about my new book, Abundantly Well, 7 Medicines.
That is great. I mean, you have such a wide variety of books. What is special about Abundantly Well?
Being 74, I'm not over the hill, but I'm on top of the hill, and I can look back over my life and see if I've had any good ideas. And in fact, I can see that I've had 3 very good ideas, and I've been teaching about these very good ideas for decades. One of the very good ideas is that there's 3 traditions of healing. The scientific tradition, which measures and fixes. The heroic tradition, which cleanses and balances. And the wise woman tradition, which nourishes the wholeness of the unique individual. This helps people make sense of healthcare because whether you're a chiropractor, an MD, or an herbalist, you can be working in any one of those 3 traditions. Another one of my very good ideas is drinking nourishing herbal infusions. A cup of nettle tea, for instance, has about 5 milligrams of calcium, whereas a cup of nettle infusion has about 250 milligrams of calcium. I just recently had a pelvic x-ray, and the doctors were astonished. I actually saw the x-ray myself, and both my pelvis and my femurs looked as though a child had taken a white crayon and colored them in. They were so dense. They said they don't see 30-year-old women with bones as dense as mine. These are the minerals in the nourishing herbal infusions that I drink. And my third good idea is that there are 7 medicines. And Abundantly Well, 7 Medicines is about these 7 medicines. Serenity medicine and story medicine, mind medicine and lifestyle medicine. These 4 are the foundational medicines. We engage in them every day. They can reverse disease process, but they also keep us healthy. Then there's a gap. And that gap reminds us that the last 3 medicines are always going to harm us. The last 3 medicines are alternative medicine, pharmaceutical medicine, and deep medicine. And deep medicine looks a little different depending on which tradition you're in. If you're in the scientific tradition where you're measuring and fixing, deep medicine is surgery and chemotherapy and radiation. And if you're in the heroic tradition, balancing and cleansing, then deep medicine is colonics and purging and bloodletting. And if you're in the wise woman tradition where you're nourishing the wholeness of the unique individual, then deep medicine is psychoactive plants.
That's a beautiful roundup.
Yeah, so that the Abundantly Well is about those 7 medicines. There's a chapter on each medicine and how to navigate within those medicines. Mind medicine is especially tricky. I call it the shaman's playground because people tend to not understand that prayer and homeopathy and acupuncture are all mind medicine.
Well, that's a lot of data that you shared with us, Susun, but I want to step back in time because you shared with us that, you are a sage in your golden years, and I'm right behind you there. But I'd like to go back and share with our listeners how you started on your path of being an herbalist.
I grew up in the 50s, and although it's hard to believe now, we really did believe then that antibiotics and drugs would eliminate disease. And it came as a great shock to me as a teenager in college because I left my home and went to college when I was 16. High school was so boring. It came as a great shock to me to discover through talking to people that drugs weren't going to save us all. As a matter of fact, the drugs I had taken had somewhat harmed me. And then I got pregnant, and I was further horrified to see pictures of thalidomide babies. I was pregnant in the mid-60s, and it was during that time that healthy pregnant women were given thalidomide and giving birth to babies without arms, without legs, or without arms or legs. So I really had my eyes opened about the dangers of drugs, and I vowed as a pregnant woman not to use any drugs at all. And like every pregnant woman, I had a little ooh and a little and a little bleh, and I wanted some help with those things. And so I went to the New York City Public Library. I was living in Manhattan at the time on the Lower East Side, and asked for books on herbs. And they gave me all 4 books they had on herbs. At this point, I've written 6 books. So I've written more books on herbs than the New York Public Library had in their stacks in 1965. Now, if I'd read a different language than English, I'm sure I could have found more. And 3 of those books told me to put basil with my tomatoes and deal with my cucumbers, which is very good advice, but it wasn't the advice I was looking for. So I really had to, let's say, go somewhat far afield. Yule Gibbons was a great ally there because Yule Gibbons was talking about eating wild plants. And I began to realize that food and medicine were very similar, and that by knowing what wild plants to eat, I could also know more about herbal medicine. And then Yule came out with a book about herbs and herbal medicine. And by the mid-70s, there were people, including Juliette de Berkeley-Levy. And I always like to honor Juliette de Berkeley-Levy, one of the true grandmothers of herbal medicine throughout the world, but especially in the United States, for turning me on to the idea of making nourishing herbal infusions. Up until then, I had been using herbal teas and using tinctures that were made with dried herbs. And, you know, truth to tell, I had to believe when people said to me that herbal medicine is more a matter of what you really think than the herbs themselves. If you believe in herbal medicine, it works, and if you don't, it won't. But once I started using tinctures made with fresh plants and making nourishing herbal infusions, my herbal medicine works for me all the time now, and I'm able to tell other people how to make remedies and how to purchase remedies that will work all the time. And rule number 1 is never use an herb that's dried and in a capsule.
Yes, and every time I walk past a nettles plant, which is often because they grow prolifically where I am at the moment on Long Island, and we give herb walks all the time. If any listeners are interested, you can go to naturalnurse.com and just let me know that you're interested in when the next herb walk is. And nettles grow prolifically, and every time I walk past them, I always think of you, Susan, because you have, for so many, many decades, really shared information about the deep and healing aspects of such a simple plant, and about making what you called simple remedies and using only nettle rather than a combination, which I actually believe there are times when combinations could be useful as well. But I always think of you when I pass my sister nettle plants, because you were a very big proponent. And also it's so wonderful because it's quite prolific, so it's not endangered. And you can get a lot out of one adult plant because they're really tall. And tell us about the stickers, because not everybody should just go up and grab a nettle plant or any plant without honoring it.
Yes, well, nettle doesn't have stickers. It has little hairs on it. And at the base of each hair is a drop of acid. And it's somewhat similar to the acid that ants make, and it's somewhat similar to the acids in bee stings. As a matter of fact, out at Botanicals on the beach a couple of years ago, I did a 2-hour class on stinging nettle. And I spent the first hour talking about all the wonderful things that I've used stinging nettle for: rebuilding the adrenals, eliminating stress, stabilizing blood sugar, and the recent research that's been done in South America showing that nettle reverses type 2 diabetes, as well as preventing it. And then for the last hour of the class, I went around the class and asked people, what's your favorite way of using nettle? And a third of the people said their favorite way of using nettle was urtication, which means you take the nettle and you actually brush or sweep the nettle across an area that is painful or inflamed, and you get stung by the nettle. And that sting actually eliminates the inflammation and the pain, much in the way that bee sting therapy does. If I'm doing a class, as you say, if we're going out on a weed walk, I ask for somebody who has a polite area. In other words, we don't want people, pulling down their pants and saying, oh, my tailbone hurts. But somebody who has like a neck pain or a shoulder pain, which is pretty polite, We can do that right there in class. And we urticate them. And then about 10 minutes later, I turn to them and I say, how's your nettle sting? And they look at me and they go, it doesn't sting at all. And oh my gosh, the pain is totally gone.
Yeah, that actually is a very well verified use and is similar to the well-documented use of apitherapy. But unfortunately, when you're doing apitherapy, the bee dies as you use it. And although the nettle plant, you can actually not kill the nettle plant. You can just cut a little part off the top and leave the rest in the root. So I find it extremely useful for that. It's also very interesting that you shared, and just let me share with our listeners that you are listening to Herbally Yours right here on the voice of Nassau Community College 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse, and today my guest is the revered herbalist Susun Weed, and we're talking about lots of things. Her new book, Abundantly Well. I'm looking at it right here, on one of the places you get books, which is everywhere. The complementary integrated medicine revolution, and I love that she calls it a revolution. So you can also find her at susunweed.com. So much is going on there. And she also has a weekly radio show on blogtalkradio.com/Susun Weed. So you can find that all at her website at susunweed.com. Now, Susun, one thing you mentioned, which actually is interesting, one of the many things that I do is collect wild plants, and I am interested in the chemistry behind them, besides the spiritual essence and the fact that they have a folkloric use. So very often in natural product chemistry laboratories, we will actually break down, we know that they work, but we're looking for active constituents that help explain the mechanism of how they work outside of the spiritual and folkloric
Scientific tradition.
Yes.
Measure and fix.
Yes. So what we have found...
Scientific tradition, yeah. It's so limited. It's so incredibly limited because plants do not work by active ingredients.
Only.
Drugs work by active ingredients.
Right.
Plants work by a combination of all of their ingredients. Let's look at Hypericum perforatum, sometimes called St. John's wort. I call it St. John's wort because it's so active against burns. And Joan knows a lot more about burning than John does as a saint. Hypericum perforatum has a collection of alkaloids, including hypericin, pseudohypericin, hyperfluorin, and so on. If you get a standardized St. John's wort tincture in the United States, it will be standardized to hypericin. But if you get it in Europe, it will be standardized to hyperfluorin because the chemists on the two sides of the Atlantic have decided on one side that this is the active ingredient and on the other side that that's the active ingredient. The fact of the matter is neither one of them is the active ingredient. It's not a drug. It's a plant. And if you don't have every constituent in the plant, you're not getting herbal medicine. You're getting fake drugs.
Well, one of the things we discovered that actually supports exactly what you're saying is in the bush where we work with healers all the time, they use an herb a certain way and very often as an infusion that you talk about. And even if you do the chemistry, you see a certain array of actives in an infusion. Then we did an experiment and made a tincture where we used an alcohol extractant for that same plant. And then we found that it actually would be quite toxic because it pulled out a whole different array of actives. So it actually supported how the native individuals in that area only would say, this one you only make, they'll just not use the word infusion, they would say as a tea. In other words, they put it in water. While another plant, they might put it in rum, but not that plant. And that's just through oral tradition, but it's absolutely right when you do investigate it because the water infusion was much more potent and also had none of the potentially toxic substances.
Exactly. And people keep talking to me about the potency of the herb, but as a woman, I'm more interested in the competency of the herb than the potency.
And what's the difference? Tell our listeners.
Competency is about the herb being whole. We're using herbs to become whole. The goal of the Wise Woman tradition is wholeness, not fixing, not balancing, not cleansing, but wholeness. In order to do that, we need the whole plant. So let me be very clear. A tea is a small amount of fresh or dried herb, generally brewed for a short time. We all know how to make chamomile tea or peppermint tea. An infusion is a large amount of dried herb, never fresh, brewed for a long time. To make a nettle infusion, for instance, I weigh out 1 ounce by weight of dried stinging nettle. I boil a quart of water. I put my dried stinging nettle either in the pan with the boiling water, turn the fire off and put the lid on, or I put my dried stinging nettle in a quart jar, fill it to the top with boiling water, stir it, put a little more water in it, put a lid on it, and then the infusion steeps for a minimum of 4 hours. There's no further heat applied, but it steeps for a minimum of 4 hours, up to 10 hours, because it takes minerals at least 4 hours to move from the plant into solution in the water. And if the plant is fresh, the minerals will never move. So an infusion is nothing like a tea.
So when you're talking about food and the difference between, let's say, cooking and raw, I know that you actually discussed the fact that using a lot of raw food may not be the best choice.
Well, if you're interested in the whole shebang, you can go to YouTube and find the raw versus cooked debate. And it's an hour debate that I have with a raw food person, Brigitte Mars, wonderful herbalist. But the short answer is nothing on this planet eats raw food because there is no nutrition of any kind available from raw food. Now, people drop their jaws and, widen their eyes at me and say, aren't your goats eating raw food? And I say, you hang out with the goats and you'll see they go up to a plant and they bite it and swallow it and bite it. They don't even bother to chew the raw food because it's just going to be a loss. And it goes into their F-O-R-E stomach. Goats do not have F-O-U-R stomachs. They have 1-4 stomach, also called the rumen. And the rumen is their cooking pot. And they put all of that raw material into their cooking pot and they cook it at a pretty high temperature and they ferment it. And if you sit next to the goat in the afternoon, she'll go burp and she'll get a big wad in her mouth and she'll chew it. And it smells just like hot sauerkraut because that's what she's actually eating. At that point, she does chew and she swallows and it goes into her real stomach because nothing on this planet eats raw food. Let's take 2 sunflower seeds, a raw sunflower seed and a roasted sunflower seed, and let's plant them. Let's plant them in the same way, in the same soil, with the same amount of sunlight, water them the same, do our rattle, whatever we're going to do over those plants. Let's do the same to these 2 seeds and wait 3 weeks. And what are we going to find? We'll find that the raw seed sprouted. But what happened to the cooked seed? It was eaten by soil microorganisms. Even soil microorganisms are loath to eat raw things. There's nothing on this planet that eats raw food, except for a few misguided human beings.
So you're saying some animals appear to eat raw food, but because of their differences in their digestive system, it's actually processed differently rather than raw.
Correct. I asked a veterinarian who was here apprenticing with me about horses because that was her specialty. And I said, horses don't have a rumen. How do they, get nutrient value? She said, well, first of all, the pass-through rate on a horse is horrible. About 90 to 95% of what a horse eats comes right out the back end. And you can actually see that if you look at, what a horse drops. You can see it's not really very well digested. She said, and that's why it's critically important that the horse eats hay. Because you see, there's 5 ways to cook plants. We can apply heat for sufficient time. Most people don't cook their plant foods anywhere near long enough. Kale, for instance, needs to be cooked for a minimum of an hour, and I find it best if it's cooked for 2 or 3 hours. So we can cook. We can freeze. Freezing is the equivalent of cooking. It breaks the cell wall of the plant. And a great many native groups, when they live in areas where it gets cold, don't even bother to harvest certain foods until they've been frozen naturally. We can also dehydrate. And native people who harvest small fruits, especially in areas where it's hot and sunny, will always dehydrate them. They hardly eat any of them raw, again, because it's a net loss to your body and to your community to eat it raw. So we can cook, we can freeze, we can dehydrate. And we can also ferment. Fermented food is richer in vitamins and often has more minerals than the original raw food. And so it is a form of cooking the food and covering in oil. Not vinegar. Vinegar does not cook, but covering in oil. So we have 5 different ways to break the cell wall of the plant and get to the nutrition. A recent study found that women who ate salad every single day without salad dressing had as much breast cancer as women who never ate salad. that women who ate salad on a daily basis with no-fat salad dressing or low-fat salad dressing had as much breast cancer as women who never ate salad. It was only the women who put at least 2 tablespoons of oil on their salad, and preferably olive oil, who got any reduction in breast cancer risk, because the oil cooks the salad and you don't have to wait for it to happen. It will happen in your body. All right? And so we can see that without the oil, no nutrition of any kind available from your salad.
And you are listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. I'm Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse. And today, my guest is the author of the Wise Woman Series and the new book, Abundantly Well. And it is Susun Weed, Herbalist. And she's joining us today right here on Herbally Yours. You can find out more about Susun and her massive amount of work for so many years at SusunWeed.com. Susun, tell us about your YouTube channel.
Oh, happily. But I want to go back for a moment, because we were
Sure.
talking about nettle and you were talking about tall nettle. And, you know, the truth of the matter is that tall nettle is not really good to harvest, because tall nettle is probably flowering or having seeds. And I don't use nettle for infusion or cooking use when it's gotten that tall. I like to harvest my nettle when it's short. And I find that if I have a nettle patch and I keep cutting it, then it will remain short. Once the nettle has gotten tall and has flowers and seeds, then again, I really do not use it at all. Although I will come back and harvest the seeds and use the seeds in cooking once those seeds are fully ripe. My daughter, once she had my granddaughter, decided that she wanted to kind of change the trajectory of what I was doing. I'm very interested in books and writing, and she wanted to expand into video because she's a videographer. And so starting when my granddaughter was a mere toddler, we have made a series of YouTubes. And so you get to see my granddaughter grow up with me and with the plants. You get to see her picking dandelion blossoms. Off camera, while I'm doing something with the dandelion blossoms, she is going and picking every calendula on the place as well, because she is not quite, at her age making a distinction between that. But that was fun. Then we made a calendula oil as well. And my granddaughter's now 12 years old. And starting about 5 or 6 years ago, we expanded from the YouTube channel, and it's a wonderful YouTube channel. I hope that you go and visit all kinds of things there, as well as a whole series of YouTubes about nourishing herbal infusions, where you can actually see me working with the plants, weighing them out. You can see me harvesting them and drying them if that's what you're interested in, although they're available commercially. And I spend thousands of dollars a year on dried herb. Right now, I'm doing a Green Goddess Week, and there are 8 Green Goddesses here, so we're making 4 gallons of nourishing herbal infusion on a daily basis to cover both the Green Goddesses and the teachers who are here. And so that's a pound of herb at a time that I'm using. Even if the apprentices and I worked all day, every day, we couldn't harvest enough to do that. So I certainly rely on buying those. But we've expanded into video courses, and you can find those at wisewomanschool.com, including a completely free course on preventing and surviving COVID. So if you're worried about COVID, or if you're concerned, or if you're wondering what herbs you might want to have on hand or even use now to help yourself, I offer you this free course at wisewomanschool.com.
Well, let's talk about COVID, since it's certainly still, oh my goodness, how many months, the topic of the day. What are some of your special Wise Woman tips in terms of whatever you would prefer? Something like protection from perhaps, or treating?
The most studied and most effective way to prevent viral infections, and especially coronavirus infections, is to eat sauerkraut. It's very simple, a fermented food, right? You could eat kimchi as well. The difficulty with kimchi is it has pepper in it, and pepper is an inflammatory substance. The Green Goddesses were told yesterday that during their week here, one of my goals is to vastly reduce the amount of inflammation in their bodies, and that I eat no pepper of any kind, and they'll be eating no pepper of any kind for the week here. And our first infusion that we started out drinking was linden, the world's greatest anti-inflammatory. I would say it's about 10 times more effective than turmeric.
Yeah, linden is a wonderful herb and somewhat underused.
Yes, indeed. It's one of my main nourishing herbal infusions, and it's another way to help protect yourself against COVID. The idea around linden is that it prevents colds and flus and also treats colds and flus. And it's used that way all around the world. Linden grows in the temperate regions, North America, China, all through Europe, everywhere in the temperate regions of the world. You're going to find linden growing in many cities. You're going to find a linden avenue because linden is a city tree. It's a herbal medicine that people who live in the cities have access to and can harvest their own very easily. Or as I said, it's an item of commerce. I was talking to someone at Mountain Rose last year, and I said, is my telling people to use, herb by an ounce at a time, which if you think about it, if you're using an ounce every day, because a quart a day is about the right amount, then you're going to be using 2 pounds of herb a month. I said, has that changed how you do business? And he said, Susan, you have totally changed the entire herbal industry in the United States. Stores used to buy herb by the pound, and people would buy herb by the ounce, and now people buy herb by the pound. It's caused many more people to have herbal farms, and it's caused the herb industry to shift its focus on how they deal with individual people because we're using herb, not just a teaspoonful at a time.
Right. It's a higher amount, and it's fresher or dried and then made. Now, do you feel it's best for people to make their own preparations rather than purchase ones that have been made elsewhere?
I'm not sure what you mean by preparations. You need to make your own nourishing herbal infusion because once you've made it, you refrigerate it and you drink it up within about 36 hours. So it's not really something that lends itself to being an item of commerce. And I've, done blindfolded tests with people, having them taste my motherwort tincture made from the fresh flowering plant in 100 proof vodka and a commercial motherwort tincture made from the dried plant in grain alcohol. And people are hard-pressed to believe that they're even the same plant. They taste so differently. They work so differently in the body. Certainly, you can get started if you want using tinctures made from dried plants and high-proof alcohol. But once you start to get interested in the plants around you, it's extremely easy to buy the 100 proof vodka and to make your own tinctures. I know tens of thousands of people who are making their own tinctures now. One of the things that I'm on about is that herbal medicine is people's medicine. And I have a wonderful story about a woman whose husband came home from the doctor and said that the doctor had put him on various heart medications, cholesterol-lowering drug and a blood pressure-lowering drug and aspirin and so on. And she said, oh, dear, let me make you an herbal remedy. And he said, you don't know. You don't have a license. You don't know what you're talking about. The doctor has a license. I'm going to take the drugs. And she felt heartbroken, and she went outside. And she lived on the West Coast where hawthorn was growing, and the hawthorn berries were glowing red. And they said to her, why don't you just make a tincture with us anyhow? And you can add it to his food or his drink, and he won't even know. And it will help moderate some of the bad effects of the drug. So she started picking hawthorn berries. And on the way in the house, she noticed that one of her red roses was blooming, and the rose said, you love him, put me in there too. So she picked that red rose, and again, she was just about to open the door when she saw a beautiful red hibiscus flower blooming in her neighbor's garden, and she was friends with her neighbor. And since that hibiscus flower is going to be gone the next day, she took that hibiscus flower because it said, you want me too. And while she was putting her remedy together, the Schisandra fell down. She began to give this to her husband surreptitiously, and then out front, and within 6 weeks, he decided to stop taking the drugs and to use her herbal remedy because he felt far better when he was using it.
Thank you so much for sharing, Susan. Thank you for tuning in, listeners, to Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. And we'll thank our guest, very preeminent herbalist, Susun Weed. Find her at susunweed.com. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.